Well, thank you to the Sisters of Charity at St. Elizabeth. Thanks to the NJPPN and their wonderful organizers and staff. It's been a real pleasure to be here, and I think we're going to have a great evening together. Speaking of being here together, I take your presence here as a sign that you're waking up to the realities of our political system, and that's a collective exercise. So I'll say that we are all waking up together to the realities of our political system, and that's not an easy process. This isn't a cat nap we're waking up from. It's something more like a deep slumber that I think we're waking up from here. And I want to spend the first part of my talk talking about what the problem is, what the reality is, what the underlying truths are that we're waking up to. So that first part of the talk is about the problem at hand. The second part of the talk is about the causes of that problem, and I'm going to leave it to Jeff Clements to talk about solutions to the problem, because I'm fairly confident we share a similar assessment of what the problem is and what the causes of it are. And Jeff has some great projects and ideas regarding the solution to it all. So let's talk a little bit about the problem. I'm going to give you some pieces of information, and I want you to ask yourselves the entire time I'm giving you each piece of information this question: what is the true nature of my political system? So let me start off with the beginnings of this primary election season, this presidential contest. When you look back to the beginning of it, it's remarkable that 158 families provided more than half of the seed money for all the campaigns. All the 2016 presidential campaigns, about $176 million. These families provided more than $250,000 each, these 158 families. And then an additional 100 families gave more than $100,000 each. Seed money, right? Launching your campaign, the viability of your campaign, all the major candidates. And then once those campaigns got rolling, and this is an early statistic, the spending was remarkable even as of October of 2015, which feels like ancient history for those of us following the campaigns and the news cycles. You think back to October, it feels like a decade ago, right? Well, as of October 2015, Jeb Bush had accumulated $103 million in outside spending, $24 million in campaign spending. Hillary Clinton had $20 million of outside spending, $77 million campaign spending. Ted Cruz had $26 million in each. Bernie Sanders had hardly any outside spending, but $41 million in campaign spending. And you can just sort of run through each candidate, and you see a tremendous amount of money at the outset. And in fact, a number of the candidates delayed declaring their candidacy in order to accumulate more funds in violation of legal limits for actual candidates. Because once you become a candidate, then there's limits, especially on coordination with super PACs and dark money groups. So there's a real strategic game going on here, which is economic and financial, for mounting a viable campaign whose construction of the issues, indeed whose very selection of which issues to prioritize, is influenced by this group of campaign donors on the one hand and outside spending groups on the other. Now, in terms of those groups, again, November of 2015, an early statistic, over $4 million in dark money. And this is money whose sources cannot be traced. Organizations whose donors do not have to be identified at any point. And that $4 million was 10 times more than the amount spent at the same point in the last general election. So there's this incredible increase. When you read the reports on this in the New York Times and the Guardian, other major newspapers, they talk about candidates courting super PACs, which are taking over many of the main functions of campaigns. So there's actually an economic outsourcing of campaign and political party functions to unaccountable outside organizations. So when you think about political parties, they're somewhat accountable to voters. When you think about candidates, they're somewhat accountable to voters. But what they're doing is outsourcing those functions of choosing issues, attacking other candidates, constructing the issues as this or in this or that way to outside groups in order to allow money to play a bigger role. 2014 was also a remarkable cycle. It's not just the present one. 2014 was remarkable. The outside expenditures in the 2014 midterms landed at $560 million. prior midterm elections went 300 million, 69 million, 27 million back in 2002. So it's rather astronomical rise. Two of the largest super PACs, the Senate Majority PAC and Rove's American Crossroads, raised $90 million, 2/3 of which from donors who gave $500,000 or more. So these are groups that are courting individuals who can spend about $500,000. And there were 200 of such donors. So you do the basic math, and 2/3 of the money to these leading super PACs is coming from 200 people. And that statistic actually holds across the board for super PAC expenditures in 2012, not just 2014. What are 200 people in terms of percentage of the adult US population? It turns out that those 200 people are 0.000084% of the overall population. Why is this significant? It means a tiny, minuscule fraction of the top 10th% or top 100th of a percent is determining issue construction, issue saliency, attack ads, basically the overall political imagination that we're all a part of, right? The environment that we're all a part of. The winners in the 11 most competitive races in 2014 had more than 131 million in dark money supporting them. I am doing something that I don't want to do. I'm clobbering you all with statistics that can make one's eyes glaze over. We could go on and on, but what are the central trends to take away, right? On the one hand, massive rise in campaign donations, such that it now costs about $1 billion to become president, about $11 million to become a senator, about $1 million to become a member of the House. Massive increases over time. I mean, it was a big deal in the year 2000, Bush v. Gore, when the campaign spent $325 million total, right, in 2000. That feels like a quaint dime store sum when compared to Obama versus Romney of over $2 billion. Right? We go from 325 million in the year 2000 to over 2 billion in 2012. It's really incredible. I mentioned the tiny, minuscule percentage of the US population that controls the outside spending, the super PACs and so on. Well, what do you think the percentage is that controls the campaign donations directly to the campaigns, to the candidates? Since the year 1992, campaign donations have been controlled by 0.7% or less of the US adult population. What do I mean by controlled? I mean 2/3 of the money. So campaigns are courting this incredibly slim sliver of the US population to get their money. Why are they doing that? Well, because there's no appreciable public financing at the federal level. There's a little bit at the presidential level, but it's now seen as defunct and not competitive. Candidates resign those funds now habitually. So how does this affect officeholder behavior? Well, candidates and officeholders spend 50% or more of their time fundraising. There was an entertaining memo leaked during the last midterms from Michelle Nunn's campaign in Georgia, advising her to spend 70 to 80% of her time raising money. So out of 2,500 campaign hours, she was recommended spending 2,201 of those hours raising money. So what does it mean for political campaigns to be centered on fundraising versus civic rallies, right? And you can look at Obama's campaign for a demonstration of that. As progressive as people think Obama is, he still had 2 times the fundraising events as he did political rallies. So there's a lot more energy spent courting $60,000 sorts of, come to my exclusive dinner kinds of people than your average citizen out there. All right, so we've covered the percentages, this tiny sliver of the American public. We've covered the fact that there's really no limits on what campaigns can raise or spend. There's no limits on what these outside groups can raise or spend. So we're in an arms race. There's a lack of public financing. So what we really have in this country, this is part of what we're waking up to, is a privatized democracy. Right? We live in a privatized democracy, which we'll ask during the course of my talk whether that's any democracy at all. Well, you still get to vote. Oh, but who can you vote for? Well, your market-dominant candidates. I don't care how progressive they are. They've spent 80% of their time fundraising. They've been able to lift up their platforms by asking for money. That's a different kind of activity than asking for civic support, allegiance, dialogue, without bringing money into the equation. So It's changed the fundamental nature of what campaigning and democracy is all about. The underlying dynamic, if all candidates and parties weren't trying to raise so much money, that would be a clue that it doesn't matter that much. But this is what most of their time is spent doing. So what does that tell us? It tells us that financial power is a precondition to political power. It tells us that financial power translates into political power. Not always, not neatly. Some candidates who don't raise the most money can actually win. There's the occasions where wealthy candidates lose. But as a general rule, the wealthier your support base and the more money you raise, of course, the greater advantage that you have, right? You have a greater and greater advantage. And generally, the wealthiest campaign wins. And you can look through race by race and you can find lots of contested races, close races, where the outside spending appears to have tipped the balance one way or another. Okay, so the underlying dynamic is financial power translating into political power. I think that raises a thought experiment that you might want to entertain, right? So here we are in the present moment. Everything seems normal to us. You know, we've got a mild problem of money in politics. It seems unfair, but hey, you know, it's all part of the trials and tribulations of a democracy. If you're thinking along those lines, you haven't woken up at all. All right, this is not a mild problem. This goes to the underlying essence of our system. Here's the thought experiment. Do you think that most people throughout history, living in monarchies and theocracies and fascist states, under dictatorships, people in feudalism, do you think that most people, most of the time throughout history, recognized the injustice of their particular situation? Do you think that in every historical moment people thought, oh yeah, no, I recognize this is a theocracy which conflates religious authority with political power, and that is a mode of subjugating me as an equal citizen? Do you think most people realize that? I'll take questions at the end if you think so. Or under monarchy, did you think most people throughout history thought, this conflation of familial power, or the power of winning certain wars and conquest, with political power is really an unjust thing? Do you think dictatorships, their stability, the wisdom, the dictator law and order, do you think people always realized that this was categorically unjust? Here's the thing, each of those systems, theocracy, monarchy, feudalism, dictatorship, had law and ideology on their sides. All right, these were official systems of rule. They weren't illegal systems of corruption. These were official systems of rule that premised political power on power from some other place, right? Whether nobility and the family, or religious authority, or control of the military, or what have you. They were premising political power on some undemocratic form of power. So you see the analogy to wealth, right? If we're premising political power on wealth, how different really are we from other systems that premise political power on something out of reach for most people, right? So that's the architecture of it, right? The architecture is power being conflated from different spheres, whether the economy, religion, the family, etc. And then the substance of it, right? That's the architecture, but the substance of what all of these systems, including modern day capitalism, what they accomplish is to impoverish the majority and enrich the minority. And we've had a lot of wake-up calls to that effect lately. And I want to start off, though, not with what you're all probably thinking Thomas Piketty already, right, and economic inequality. But I want to start off with an earlier analyst of the capitalist system who wrote in 1776, that our merchants and master manufacturers complain about the bad effects of high wages, but they're silent with regard to the pernicious effects of their own gains. Those who employ the largest capitals and dealers in any particular branch of trade are an order of men whose interest is not exactly the same with that of the public, who have generally an interest to deceive and to oppress the public, and who accordingly have both deceived and oppressed it on many occasions. Considering these classes to use wealth to draw to themselves the greatest share of public attention, Adam Smith recommended that proposed laws be long and carefully examined, not only with the most scrupulous, but with the most suspicious attention. Those quotes about the wealthy master manufacturers, trade organizations, that's Adam Smith, actually, in 1776. This kind of warning that wealth was controlling laws was also given in 1816 by somebody who sounds like a radical socialist to me, but I'll tell you who he is in a second. This country is headed toward a single and splendid government of an aristocracy founded on banking institutions and moneyed in corporations. If this tendency continues, it will be the end of freedom and democracy. The few will be ruling and riding over the plundered plowman and beggar. Who is that radical writer? It's Thomas Jefferson, the author of the Declaration of Independence, big part of the First Amendment. There's a lot of these warnings throughout history. I'm not going to give all of them to you for reasons of time, about a manufacturing aristocracy. An aristocracy, right? King George III was part of a royal aristocracy. This relates to an elite group that average people can't get into who control politics. So when they're talking about a manufacturing aristocracy controlling policies instead of a royal aristocracy, they're saying the architecture has shifted. Thomas Jefferson and Adam Smith and Alexis de Tocqueville said the same thing. The power center has shifted. It's no longer about royal power. It's now about the power of wealth. Abraham Lincoln said, as a result of the Civil War, corporations have been enthroned and an era of corruption in high places will follow. The money power of the country will endeavor to prolong its reign by working upon the prejudices of the people until all wealth is aggregated in a few hands and the republic is destroyed. These are not mild terms, right? When I say that we need to wake up to the realities of money in politics, I mean it's time to start thinking more like Lincoln and Jefferson and Adam Smith, who see these issues quite clearly because they were intimately involved with systems that subjugated people. And they understood that that sort of subjugation could continue, and if it was going to survive, naturally it had to change forms. We're not going to buy monarchy anymore. We're not going to buy theocracy anymore. We're not going to buy dictatorship anymore. So what is the way in which the few can continue to rule over the many? Well, they have to shift the form of it all. And in fact, the oldest quote on all of these matters is from John Locke, who talked about the definition of tyranny. And what Locke said, if I can find the quote, is that tyranny is the exercise of power beyond right, not for the good of those who are under it, but for one's own private, separate advantage. Now, clearly, King George III qualified, and the American Revolution is justified as a revolution against tyranny. But here's what else Locke said. It is a mistake to think that this fault of tyranny is proper only to monarchies. Other forms of government are liable to it as well. For wherever power is put into the hands for government and for the people, but it's made use of to impoverish, harass, or subdue the people, there it presently becomes tyranny. So Locke said that over 300 years ago in his definition of tyranny. Now, is there any chance that Lincoln and Locke and Smith were onto something with the impoverishment of the people, with the few riding over the plundered plowman and beggar? Now let's get to Thomas Piketty. In fact, let's get to 3 studies or 3 documents from 2014. So we're going from 350 to 150 years ago to April of 2014, where actually these 3 studies were released within 2 weeks of each other. It was incredible. I was sort of falling off my desk in this period between April 2nd and April 15th of 2014. First comes Thomas Piketty. He says, the United States is the most unequal economically of all advanced democracies. Our top 10% of wealth holders in this country own 70% of national wealth. All right. Now, what do the bottom 50%, the lower half of the entire country, own in terms of national wealth? 2% of national wealth. Our bottom half owns 2% of national wealth. Our top 10% owns 70% of national wealth. Now, that's not inevitable. Piketty goes through in this massive book, Capital in the 21st Century, and says, capitalism hasn't always been so equal. This is the result of, well, deregulation, privatization of national wealth. This is the result of law and policy that makes capitalism so unequal. Okay, well, where do laws and policies like that come from? Within just 1 week of Thomas Piketty comes Gillens and Page, Marty Gillens and Ben Page, political scientists at Princeton and Northwestern universities. Okay, these aren't hacks. These are the real deal in statistical regression, in public policy analysis. 2,000 issue areas at the federal level survey of how they've been handled versus public policy preferences of average Americans. Marty Gillens and Ben Page say, economic elites and organized groups representing business interests have substantial independent impacts on government policy, while mass-based interest groups and average citizens have little or no independent influence. Little to no independent influence. Gillens and Page say when average Americans get their way on a policy issue, it's a coincidence. They get their way because the groups that matter either didn't care or had the same preference. All right, and this is a statistical analysis of 2,000 issue areas. They say, in conclusion, that America's claims to being a democratic society are seriously threatened because policymaking is dominated by powerful business organizations and a small number of affluent Americans. Now, I would feel vaguely socialistic or communistic if I were up here just assailing capitalism and business groups, but I just want to be clear in terms of my own political ideology so that maybe you trust me a little, that I think that this corrupts capitalism every bit as much as it corrupts democracy. All right? If you care about efficiency, well, ask an economist what they think about rent-seeking and political expenditures by companies. Companies and wealthy individuals are looking to manipulate law and policy to get ahead in economic markets, not on the basis of their products, their services, their innovations, and so on, but on the basis of law and policies that favor their industry or their particular mode of business. Right? These are artificial advantages that Adam Smith, Ayn Rand, and a bunch of Nobel-winning economists have condemned. So this isn't an anti-capitalist sort of speech. I just want to get that caveat out there. I actually am in favor of economic freedom. I just don't think economic freedom should take over the political sphere. That gets me to the third document that came out between April 2nd and April 15th in 2014. The third document is McCutcheon v. FEC, a Supreme Court opinion striking down a Watergate-era limit on how much money each individual person could donate to all candidates and political committees in total. So if you're a wealthy person with an interest in politics, and say you want to aid all the Democratic candidates across the country, as well as all the Democratic committees, local, state, etc., you could, as of 2014, only give $123,000 total. I say only, but $123,000 is more than a lot of people will make over, several years at least. So to have that kind of money just in your checkbook to, disposable income is remarkable. That was our limit. McCutcheon v. FEC strikes down that limit and puts us into a regime of, multi-million-dollar campaign contributions, which we hadn't seen since Watergate. Now, that's the law. The law is that aggregate contribution limits are now unconstitutional. The ideology behind the law is quite interesting. So the court says that the First Amendment safeguards an individual's right to participate in the public debate, and when an individual contributes money to a candidate, they are exercising political expression and political association, First Amendment rights. So giving money to candidates is an exercise of First Amendment rights. Okay, great, but then couldn't we limit First Amendment rights in the interest of political equality or democratic integrity or protecting office holders' time so they could listen to ordinary people, not just donors and spenders? The court says no. Government regulation may not target the general gratitude a candidate may feel towards those who support him or his allies, or the political access that support may afford. So when you spend money, you're looking for political access and influence, aren't you? That's why you spend the money. Sometimes you're just ideologically committed, but on a systematic level, when you're spending hundreds of thousands of dollars, oftentimes, you would like some access or influence. The court says, quote, ingratiation and access are not corruption. They embody a central feature. Yeah, I know, I would laugh too if it wasn't constitutional law, but I'm deathly serious because this is the law of the land now. The ingratiation and access embody a central feature of democracy, that constituents support candidates who share their beliefs and interests, and candidates who are elected can be expected to be responsive to those concerns. So the Supreme Court has redefined government responsiveness, or representative governance, our form of democracy, as sensitivity to donors. The court goes on and compares Thomas Paine, the revolutionary, to big donors. And that's ironic because Tom Paine was actually on the French National Convention, and he said the French have the honor of adding égalité to liberté, right? I'm slaughtering French, but the French have the honor of incorporating equality into their constitutional order in a way that we're not doing. And here's the Supreme Court saying Thomas Paine is just like one of these big donors. Well, actually, he would have hated this. So I told you that these prior regimes of subjugation, theocracy, communism, monarchy, and so on, had law and ideology on their side and that they were official systems of rule. What I think we have to wake up to is plutocracy, rule by or for the wealthy, and that this is not, just as the Supreme Court says, this is not a system of corruption in the United States, because corruption is unlawful. If it were just a system of lawbreakers, that would not be as big of a threat. What it is today is a system of rule pursuant to law and ideology. That's an official system of rule. In other words, plutocracy is actually our official governmental system in this country. And I have 376 pages to say about that here. It's hard to make the case in just 30 minutes. But let me take you through some of these cases that constitute the law and the ideology that legitimizes American plutocracy, okay, in case you don't believe me. So political exclusion in this country is sort of a negative phrase, right? We conceive of ourselves as the enemies of political exclusion, the American way, the American dream, the civil rights revolution from the abolition of slavery to due process and equal protection and voting for African Americans, voting for women, voting for the Chinese, voting for Native Americans. The whole movement was a process of political inclusion, not political exclusion. And when Congress got through the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act in the 60s, the next thing they hit was political exclusion on the basis of wealth. And that's the Federal Election Campaign Act, especially the 1974 provisions. Contribution limits, expenditure limits. So this comes to the Supreme Court under judicial review and a case challenging the contribution limits and the expenditure limits. When Congress put those in place, what they wanted to do, and these were the official state purposes for the regulation, was to combat corruption. But that's fine. Everybody wants to combat corruption. Here's the part that was debatable. Equalize the relative ability of all citizens to affect the outcome of elections and slow the skyrocketing cost of campaigns. Right, so what is a legal regime that would help plutocracy, right? It's sort of ironic because the legal regime that would help plutocracy, right? If you want government of, by, and for the wealthy, you just want an absence of law. You don't need law saying the wealthy can do whatever they want. You just need no law on the topic. So this is more of a matter of striking down laws that pursue political equality, right? This is a matter of ridding the country of the laws that pursue democratic integrity so that we have an open market, like I described to you at the beginning of the talk. An open market for contributions, an open market for campaign expenditures, so that the free market can decide who wins and loses and what views are popular and so on. So if you want a free market, you need deregulation. You need the privatization of democracy, not law on the books, right? So the Supreme Court takes the case involving the Federal Election Campaign Act and campaign finance reform, and it strikes down expenditure limits. No law. So the court's reasoning here is, first of all, that the First Amendment denies government the power to determine that spending to promote your political views is wasteful or excessive or unwise. In the free society ordained by our Constitution, it's not the government but the people who will retain control over the quantity and range of debate in a political campaign. The court decided that money was the same thing as speech in our, quote, mass society. So this is interesting because the people had decided through the Congress, and this was wildly popular, that campaign spending should be restrained. And then the court says the people have to decide. This is very Orwellian. The people did decide they don't want unlimited spending. The court says, no, the government can't decide that. The people have to decide that. And that's highly confusing. What the court means is the market has to decide that, right? And you vote with your dollars, right? So the court goes on to the political equality interest, and it says The concept that government can restrict the speech of some elements of our society to enhance the relative voice of others is wholly foreign to the First Amendment, which was designed to secure the widest possible dissemination of information. Of course, unlimited expenditures doesn't give you the widest possible dissemination of information. It gives you market-dominant voices, and then the diversity of voices is eclipsed, much like a monopoly or a duopoly in an economic market. You need restraints on these things, or else you won't have competition in the marketplace for political ideas. So the court continues that worldview. It says in Citizens United that the state interest in restraining corporate political power is an interference with the, quote, open marketplace of ideas protected by the First Amendment. First Amendment protects an open marketplace of ideas. You can't restrict corporate power by saying it has undue influence, right? It says limited liability, perpetual life, this is the court, favorable treatment of the accumulation of assets do not suffice to allow laws prohibiting speech. So when corporations gave or wanted to give unlimited sums from general treasury funds, that's an exercise of free speech rights. And all the things about the corporate form that make it different aren't a valid reason to regulate, right? That corporate speakers may have influence or access to elected officials does not mean that those officials are corrupt. Favoritism and influence are not avoidable in representative politics, right? This redefinition of democracy. The court has gone on and on to elaborate this ideology. Another really interesting case is Bennett, Arizona Free Enterprise v. Bennett, which was an important state-based campaign finance system. And what it did is it provided matching funds for candidates who wanted to run and compete with privately financed candidates. So when one of the privately financed candidates got $2,500 in a contribution or in an outside expenditure that favored them, the publicly financed candidate would get the same $2,500, and it was like a ping pong match, right? And if you're interested in the diversity of ideas, this might not be a bad idea, because the big spenders can't dominate and root out the other ideas, right? So you got that competition of viewpoints, but the court struck that down as well on First Amendment free speech grounds, saying that the matching fund system burdened the plaintiff's ability to fully exercise their First Amendment rights. The whole point of the First Amendment is to protect speakers against government restrictions on speech, even when those restrictions reflect the will of the majority. Now, it is ideological, because the First Amendment just says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. When the Arizona legislature decided to give money to publicly financed candidates, right, they're not restricting anybody's speech, they're adding money to the equation. But what the court said is that this is an abridgment because it diminishes the effectiveness of private donations and expenditures. The matching fund system, right, if you're a private donor or spender and you're giving money to candidate A, and every time you do that, candidate B gets public funds, well, yeah, that diminishes your effectiveness of all your donations and your spending over here because the other side can respond to you. And the court said that abridges your First Amendment rights because it diminishes the effectiveness of your speech. So the takeaway points from this sort of sprawling talk are that the Supreme Court is the ideological architect of this system. When Thomas Piketty reflects on economic inequality in the United States today, he says, ideology is the most important thing in determining how long inequality will be tolerated, right? The question isn't how bad inequality has gotten, because it's gotten incredibly bad, and it's rarely been worse than this. The question is there an apparatus of justification? Do people have a reason to think this inequality is lawful and appropriate somehow? And that's what the Supreme Court has done. They've taken care of both the lawful part and the appropriate and justifiable part. So I should conclude there because I'm out of time. But I hope you have a sense of the problem as an unregulated political sphere where money translates into political power. The Supreme Court is at the heart of that, and I'm very curious to hear what we should do about it.